Sometimes the most forgotten souls carry the brightest light. In a world that turns away from the broken, it takes someone special to see what others miss. 12-year-old Ruby was born blind in Hollow Creek, a town that had given up on hope long before she arrived. Every day she crawled through dusty streets collecting scraps, bent spoons, torn cloth, empty bottles. People called it trash. Ruby called it treasure. Behind the general store in her small shelter, she arranged each piece with care. Her fingers told her stories about every item she found. One morning, an old cowboy named Wade watched her work. He saw something the whole town had missed. Ruby wasn't just collecting garbage. She was creating something beautiful. But could a blind girl and a tired cowboy really change an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hollow Creek wasn't always a place where dreams came to die. 20 years back, when the railroad surveyors came through with their brass instruments and leather-bound promises, folks believed their little settlement would bloom into something grand. The town had positioned itself perfectly at the crossroads of 3 cattle trails, with good water and grazing land stretching toward the horizon. Children played in streets that would soon bustle with commerce, and their parents counted the days until prosperity arrived on iron rails. But the railroad chose a different route. The surveyors packed their instruments and rode away, taking the town's future with them. One by one, the younger families departed for opportunities elsewhere, leaving behind the old, the stubborn, and the broken. What remained was a collection of weathered buildings and weathered souls, all growing grey under the relentless prairie sun. Ruby had been born into this fading world 12 years ago, during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Her mother, a traveling woman whose name nobody bothered to learn, died bringing her into the world. The child's blindness became apparent within days, and the midwife who delivered her simply shook her head. "This one won't last the winter," she'd pronounced, as if Ruby were already marked for the graveyard. Doc Harrison, a man whose medical knowledge came more from necessity than formal training, had disagreed. He'd taken the infant to his small clinic above the general store and kept her alive through those brutal months. But come spring, when the snows melted and revealed all the winter's casualties, Doc found himself with a healthy child and no place to put her. The town had no orphanage, no system for caring for unwanted children. A few families offered to take her in, but their charity lasted only as long as Ruby remained quiet and invisible. When she began walking and exploring, when her small hands reached for everything within touch, the offers dried up. "That child's unnatural," they whispered. "Touches things she shouldn't, knows things she couldn't." By age 5, Ruby lived primarily in the spaces between, behind buildings, under boardwalks, in the narrow alleys where refuse gathered. She learned to move through town like a ghost, existing on the edges of a community that had decided she didn't belong. Doc Harrison left food for her when he could, and Mrs. Henley at the general store sometimes set aside day-old bread. But their help came with the understanding that Ruby should remain grateful and silent. The town's attitude toward Ruby reflected something deeper, a collective exhaustion with anything that required effort or compassion. Hollow Creek had grown tired of trying, tired of hoping, tired of caring for anything beyond immediate survival. The people who remained had been weathered smooth by disappointment, like river stones worn down by endless current. Sheriff Clayton embodied this weariness. A man in his 60s who'd taken the badge because nobody else wanted it. He maintained order through a philosophy of least resistance. Problems that stayed quiet got ignored. Problems that made noise got removed. Ruby, for all her strange ways, had learned to stay quiet. Mrs. Henley ran the general store with the efficiency of someone who'd long ago stopped expecting surprises. Her shelves held the basics: flour, beans, tobacco, ammunition, and nothing more. She'd stopped ordering pretty things, decorative items, anything that suggested people might have dreams beyond simple sustenance. When customers commented on the store's sparse offerings, she'd shrug and say, "Order what you need. if you can pay for it. Doc Harrison maintained the closest thing to hope that existed in Hollow Creek. His clinic treated everything from bullet wounds to childhood fevers, and he never asked for payment he knew wouldn't come. But even Doc had grown cautious about extending himself too far. He'd learned that in a town full of wounded people, a man could exhaust himself, trying to heal everyone. Ruby had developed her own relationship with each of these adults. She knew Sheriff Clayton's patrol schedule and avoided his routes. She understood Mrs. Henley's moods and approached the store only when the woman seemed least irritated. With Doc Harrison, she'd learned to accept help without expecting it to last. Her survival depended on invisibility, but invisibility required constant vigilance. Ruby had developed an acute sensitivity to sound, movement, and mood that let her navigate the town's unspoken rules. She could tell when someone approached by the sound of their footsteps on different surfaces. She recognized voices at distances that amazed even herself. Most importantly, she'd learned to sense hostility before it turned toward her. The broken weather vane that topped the general store had become Ruby's favorite find. She discovered it behind the building after a storm, its ornate rooster design bent but still beautiful under her exploring fingers. The metalwork told stories of craftsmanship from a more hopeful time, when someone had cared enough to create something both functional and lovely. Ruby kept it in her shelter, where she could trace its curves and imagine the hands that had shaped it. Her shelter behind the general store had grown sophisticated over the years. What began as a simple lean-to of scrapwood had evolved into a complex system of spaces, each serving a specific purpose. One area held her collection of found objects, carefully sorted by type and potential. Another contained her few personal possessions, a worn blanket Doc had given her, a tin cup she'd rescued from the trash, and the weather vane that had become her treasured companion. The organization of her collection revealed a mind that understood systems and relationships in ways that surprised adults who bothered to notice. Ruby grouped items by material, by size, by the story her fingers told her about their original purpose. Bent nails went with other bent nails, but sorted by size. Pieces of cloth were arranged by texture and thickness. Every item had its place, and Ruby could locate anything within moments. This systematic approach extended to her daily routine. Ruby woke before dawn, when the town still slept and the streets belonged to her alone. She'd move through her established routes, checking the places where useful items might appear. Behind the blacksmith shop, near the church steps, around the saloon's back door. Her hands had memorized the texture of everything worth keeping versus everything worth leaving behind. The townspeople who noticed Ruby at all saw only a beggar girl collecting garbage. They missed the careful selection process, the way she tested each item for weight and balance, the quiet pride with which she carried her findings home. They couldn't see past her blindness to recognize the intelligence that guided her choices. But on this particular morning, as Ruby arranged her latest discoveries in careful rows behind the general store, someone was watching. Wade Thorne had arrived in Hollow Creek the previous evening, just another drifter looking for temporary work and temporary shelter. He'd spent the night in the stable, paying for the privilege with labor rather than coin, and had emerged to find the town already awake and going about its business. Wade carried himself like a man who'd seen considerable life, though he moved with the careful gait of someone nursing old injuries. His clothes were clean but well worn, his boots resoled multiple times, his hat shaped by weather and time. Everything about him suggested a person who took care of what he had, because he understood its value. Standing in the shadow of the building across from the general store, Wade observed Ruby's morning ritual with growing interest. He watched her sort through the items she'd collected, noting the deliberate way she handled each piece. When she set aside a bent spoon after careful examination, Wade found himself wondering what her fingers had discovered that made it worthy of keeping. The weather vane caught his attention immediately. Even from his distance, Wade could see it was no ordinary piece of metalwork. The craftsmanship spoke of skilled hands and careful attention to detail. that a blind child had recognized its value while the rest of the town had let it lie. With the refuse said something significant about her abilities. Ruby seemed to sense his observation. She paused in her work, turning her head toward his location with the particular alertness of someone accustomed to being watched. Wade remained still, not wanting to frighten her, but understanding that their paths had already begun to intersect in ways neither of them yet comprehended. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the dusty street. Ruby completed her sorting and disappeared into her shelter, leaving Wade with questions he hadn't expected to have about a blind girl and her collection of discarded treasures. Something about her careful attention to objects others had dismissed reminded him of possibilities he'd thought he'd lost forever. In Hollow Creek, a town that had forgotten how to hope, two broken people were about to discover that the most valuable things are often hidden in plain sight. Wade waited until Ruby left for her afternoon foraging before approaching her shelter. He'd spent the morning helping repair fence posts for the stable owner, but his mind kept returning to the careful way the blind girl had handled each item in her collection. Something about her methodical sorting suggested an intelligence that the town either couldn't see or chose to ignore. The shelter itself impressed him more than he'd expected. What appeared from a distance to be a ramshackle lean-to revealed itself as a thoughtfully constructed space. Salvaged boards formed walls that provided both privacy and protection from the elements. A piece of canvas stretched overhead created a roof that would shed rain effectively. Everything showed signs of careful maintenance and gradual improvement, but the collection inside took Wade's breath away. Arranged on makeshift shelves and sorted into precise categories were dozens of items that told the story of a town's discarded history. Wade recognized immediately what others had missed. This wasn't garbage at all. Ruby had been unconsciously curating a museum of Hollow Creek's forgotten treasures. His practiced eye catalogued the contents with growing amazement. A silver butter knife with the maker's mark still visible beneath the tarnish, worth at least $5 to the right buyer. A piece of blue and white china from what had obviously been an expensive set, its delicate pattern still clear despite a hairline crack. A brass door handle with intricate engravings that spoke of craftsmanship from back east. Each item would have been dismissed as worthless by people who saw only the damage. But Wade understood restoration and value. The hand-carved wooden horse drew his attention immediately. No larger than his palm, the toy showed the skilled work of someone who understood both wood and the spirit of the animal it represented. The carving captured the essence of a Mustang in motion, head high, mane flowing, legs positioned as if frozen mid-gallop. Despite scratches and a missing piece of the tail, the horse radiated the care and love that had gone into its creation. Wade picked up the carving, turning it slowly in his hands. The wood had been selected perfectly, its grain following the horse's form in ways that enhanced the sculpture's natural movement. Someone had spent considerable time creating this piece, probably as a gift for a beloved child. Now it sat among Ruby's treasures, valued by a blind girl who could appreciate its craftsmanship through touch alone. Put that down. The voice startled Wade from his examination. Ruby stood at the entrance to her shelter, her slight frame tense with protective anger. Her unseeing eyes fixed on him with unsettling accuracy, as if she could see exactly where he stood and what he held. "I wasn't stealing," Wade said gently, setting the wooden horse back in its designated place. "I was admiring it." "Nobody admires my things," Ruby replied, her voice carrying years of learned suspicion. "They just take them or throw them away." Wade remained still, recognizing the careful distance Ruby maintained, close enough to defend her possessions, far enough away to run if necessary. "My name's Wade Thorne," he said. "I arrived yesterday evening." "I know. You've been watching me?" Ruby's head tilted slightly, a gesture that reminded Wade of a bird listening for danger. "Men who watch usually want something." The statement carried implications that made Wade's stomach tighten. A blind 12-year-old girl living alone would have learned to be wary of male attention for reasons beyond simple theft. "I was watching because I'm impressed by your collection," he said carefully. "You have an eye for quality?" Ruby's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to confusion. "I can't see anything." "That's not what I meant." Wade gestured toward the organized shelves, then remembered the gesture was meaningless to her. "You found things with your hands that most people miss with their eyes. This wooden horse, for instance, it's beautiful work. Probably carved by someone who really knew horses. You think it's beautiful?" The question came quietly, as if Ruby wasn't sure she should ask it. "I think it's one of the finest pieces of folk art I've seen in years," Wade replied honestly. "The person who made this understood how to let the wood tell its own story. See how the grain follows the horse's neck? That's not accident, that's skill." Ruby moved closer, her wariness battling with curiosity. "Most people say it's just a broken toy. Most people don't know how to look at things properly." Wade kept his voice matter-of-fact, the way he'd talk to any adult discussing a shared interest. "Would you mind if I looked at some of your other pieces?" The question clearly surprised Ruby. People usually took what they wanted from her collection without asking permission. "Why?" "Because I think you've been finding treasures that everyone else has been throwing away," Wade said. "And I'd like to understand how you do it." Ruby studied him with that unnerving directness, her head tilted as if she were listening to more than just his words. Whatever she heard seemed to satisfy her, because she stepped aside and gestured toward the shelves. "You can look, but don't move anything. Everything has its place." Wade spent the next hour examining Ruby's collection with the reverence of a man in a museum. Each item revealed itself as more valuable than its appearance suggested. A tarnished locket contained a photograph of a family that had probably left town years ago. A bent candlestick showed the hallmarks of genuine silver beneath layers of neglect. A piece of colored glass had been cut and polished into a decorative pendant that would have adorned a lady's dress. "Where did you find this?" Wade asked, holding up the silver candlestick. "Behind the church, after the storm last month," Ruby replied. "It was under some boards, like someone had hidden it there." Someone probably had. Wade examined the piece more closely. "And during hard times, people bury their valuables rather than sell them. They plan to come back for them later, but they don't come back." "No," Wade said quietly. "They don't." Ruby moved through her collection with practiced ease, her fingers identifying each item without hesitation. "I always wondered why people threw away things that felt so carefully made. My hands can tell when someone put love into making something. That's a rare gift," Wade said. "Most people have forgotten how to feel the difference between something made with care and something made just to sell." The conversation continued as the afternoon wore on, with Ruby sharing the stories of her finds, and Wade explaining the history and value he could see in each piece. For the first time in her life, Ruby found herself talking with someone who understood that her collection represented more than an accumulation of discards. When Ruby mentioned that she sometimes heard townspeople talking about items they'd lost, jewelry, decorations, mementos of departed family members, Wade began to understand something that even Ruby hadn't fully realized. She wasn't just collecting valuable objects. She was preserving the scattered pieces of Hollow Creek's history, items that connected the present to better times. "Ruby," Wade said carefully, "have you ever thought about returning some of these things to their original owners?" Ruby's expression clouded. "They threw them away. If they wanted them, they wouldn't have thrown them away. Sometimes people lose things by accident. Sometimes they have to leave things behind when they can't carry them." Wade picked up the family photograph in the locket. "Someone might be heartbroken that they lost this." The idea clearly troubled Ruby. She'd organized her life around the assumption that discarded meant unwanted, the possibility that some of her treasures represented someone else's loss rather than their. Indifference challenged everything she understood about her place in the world. "Would you help me figure out which things might have been lost instead of thrown away?" Ruby asked finally. "I'd be honored to help you," Wade replied. Neither of them noticed Sheriff Clayton watching from across the street, his expression growing more troubled with each passing minute. In a town that valued quiet predictability, a drifter spending hours with the blind beggar girl looked like the beginning of complications he didn't want to handle. Wade arrived at Ruby's shelter the next morning, carrying a bucket of water, clean rags, and a small brush he'd borrowed from the stable. Ruby emerged from her lean-to at the sound of his approach, her posture cautious but no longer defensive. "Good morning, Ruby," Wade said, settling the bucket on the ground with careful deliberation. "I brought some cleaning supplies. Thought we might see what some of your pieces look like under all that tarnish." Ruby approached slowly, her fingers exploring the rim of the bucket. "You want to clean my things?" "I want to help you see what you've really found," Wade replied. "Sometimes treasure hides under dirt and neglect. Your hands can tell quality, but your eyes, well, cleaning might help other people see what you already know." The idea intrigued Ruby enough that she retrieved the tarnished silver locket from her collection. Wade showed her how to work the soft cloth over the metal surface, explaining how the black tarnish would give way to reveal the original shine. Ruby's sensitive fingers could feel the difference immediately as the metal grew smoother under the gentle pressure. "It's getting warm," Ruby observed, surprise evident in her voice. "Silver does that when you polish it," Wade explained. "It's like the metal remembers how it used to look." As they worked together, Wade found himself sharing knowledge he hadn't used in years. He explained the differences between silver and silver plate, how to test metal by its weight and sound, the way certain makers left distinctive marks on their work. Ruby absorbed every detail with the intensity of someone discovering a new language. Their quiet work was interrupted by Doc Harrison's arrival. The older man approached with the measured steps of someone unsure of his welcome, his medical bag slung over his shoulder from his morning rounds. "Morning, Ruby," Doc said, his eyes taking in the cleaning supplies and the stranger beside her. "I see you've made a friend." "This is Wade," Ruby said, not pausing in her careful polishing. "He knows about valuable things." Doc Harrison studied Wade with the assessing gaze of a man who'd learned to judge character quickly. "Wade Thorne," Wade offered, rising to shake the doctor's hand. "I've been admiring Ruby's collection." "Collection?" Doc's eyebrows rose slightly. "Most folks call it scavenging. Most folks don't look closely enough," Wade replied. He gestured toward the locket in Ruby's hands, which was beginning to show its true silver surface. "This is a fine piece of jewelry, probably worth more than most people in this town see in a month." Doc Harrison leaned closer, his expression shifting as he recognized the quality emerging under Ruby's careful cleaning. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "I remember when Martha Kellins wore a locket just like that one. Lost it when her family packed up and left for California." Ruby's hands stilled on the cloth. "This belonged to someone who lived here?" "Martha treasured that locket," Doc continued. "Had a picture of her children inside. Nearly broke her heart to lose it before they left town." Wade watched Ruby process this information. The idea that her treasures might represent other people's losses clearly disturbed her, but he could also see her mind working through the implications. "Could we find out where Martha went?" she asked quietly. "We could try," Doc said gently, "though it's been 3 years since they left." The conversation revealed more than Wade had expected about Ruby's place in the town. Doc Harrison clearly cared about the girl, but his care came with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd learned not to expect too much. When Wade asked about Ruby's history, Doc shared the story in matter-of-fact tones that couldn't quite hide his sadness. "Born during the worst blizzard in 20 years, Doc explained. "Mother died in childbirth, father was never identified. I kept her alive that first winter, but finding someone willing to raise a blind child proved harder than expected." "She's obviously intelligent," Wade observed. "Bright as a new penny," Doc agreed. "But intelligence doesn't matter much when people are already struggling to feed their own families. And Ruby's always been different, too aware of things she shouldn't be able to know, too good at finding things others lose." Ruby had returned to her polishing, but Wade could tell she was listening to every word. He wondered how many similar conversations she'd overheard over the years, discussions of her life as if she weren't present to hear them. What do you mean, too good at finding things? Wade asked. Doc glanced at Ruby before answering. She finds things that haven't been lost long enough to end up where she finds them. Things that should still be in people's houses, or buried deeper than a child could reach. It's like she knows where to look. Wade studied Ruby with new interest. Her systematic approach to collecting suddenly seemed less random and more directed. Ruby, he said carefully, how do you decide where to search each day? Ruby's hands slowed their movement on the locket. I follow the sounds, she said quietly. What sounds? Things that want to be found make different sounds than things that want to stay lost, Ruby explained, as if this were perfectly logical. Lost things call out. Thrown away things stay quiet. Doc Harrison shook his head with familiar resignation. See what I mean? How does a person explain something like that? But Wade found himself nodding slowly. He'd known trackers who claimed similar abilities, men who could sense the presence of game or water in ways that couldn't be explained logically. I think Ruby hears what the rest of us miss, he said. The validation clearly surprised Ruby. She turned toward Wade with an expression of wonder, as if no one had ever suggested that her strange ability might be a gift rather than a peculiarity. Their work session continued for another hour, with Doc Harrison staying to watch the transformation of several pieces under careful cleaning. When Mrs. Henley approached from the general store, drawn by curiosity about the unusual gathering behind her building, she found them examining a brass door handle that had emerged from beneath years of tarnish to reveal intricate engravings. What's all this commotion? Mrs. Henley demanded, though her tone carried more curiosity than irritation. We're discovering what Ruby's been collecting, Wade explained, holding up the restored door handle. This is quality brasswork, probably from one of the original buildings in town. Mrs. Henley examined the piece with the experienced eye of someone who'd seen prosperity come and go. That looks like the hardware from the old hotel, she said slowly. Been wondering what happened to those fixtures when the building came down. Ruby's face lit up with sudden understanding. You could use this in your store. Good hardware like this would make your doors work better. The suggestion caught Mrs. Henley off guard. She'd grown accustomed to thinking of Ruby as a burden, rather than someone who might offer something useful. I suppose it might work, she said grudgingly. Ruby's got an eye for quality, Wade said. Maybe she could help you identify other useful pieces from her collection. The idea of the blind beggar girl contributing something valuable to the community represented a shift in thinking that Mrs. Henley wasn't quite ready to embrace. But the brass door handle was undeniably useful, and her practical nature warred with her prejudices. We'll see, she said finally, though her tone had softened considerably. 3 days later, Wade brought a collection of thin wire and small tools to Ruby's shelter. He'd spent his evenings at the stable fashioning simple instruments from scrap metal, pliers, wire cutters, and a small hammer that would fit comfortably in Ruby's hands. Today, we're going to try something different, Wade announced, settling beside her workspace. Instead of just cleaning what you found, we're going to make something new. Ruby ran her fingers over the tools, testing their weight and balance. Make what? Wade picked up a piece of bent tin she'd collected and a length of wire. A windmill, the kind that spins in the breeze and catches the light. He began bending the wire into a framework, showing Ruby how to feel the developing structure. Your fingers understand shapes better than most people's eyes do. I think you might be a natural at this kind of work. The concept fascinated Ruby immediately. She'd always arranged her collection with an eye toward pattern and balance, but the idea of creating something entirely new from her found materials, opened possibilities she'd never considered. Wade guided her through the basics, how to bend wire without breaking it, how to attach tin pieces so they'd catch the wind, how to balance the whole construction so it would spin freely. Ruby's hands proved remarkably adept at the delicate work. Her sensitive touch let her feel stress points in the wire before they became breaks, and her natural sense of proportion created graceful curves where another person might have struggled. Their first windmill was simple, a star-shaped frame with tin blades that caught even the slightest breeze. When Wade mounted it on a wooden pole and set it beside Ruby's shelter, The gentle, spinning sound delighted her more than any toy she'd ever owned. "It sounds like whispers," Ruby observed, tilting her head to catch the soft noise of metal moving through air. "Wind chimes do that too," Wade said. "Sound and movement together can make beautiful things." Word of their project spread through Hollow Creek with the efficiency of small-town gossip. Mrs. Henley found reasons to step outside her store more frequently, watching the strange windmill turn in the breeze. Sheriff Clayton made extra patrols past the alley, his expression suggesting he wasn't sure whether to be concerned or simply curious. But it was the arrival of traveling merchant Jacob Steinberg that changed everything. The grizzled trader pulled his loaded wagon up to the general store just as Wade and Ruby were testing their third windmill, a more complex design that incorporated pieces of colored glass Ruby had found behind the old saloon. Jacob approached their workspace with the measured interest of a man who'd learned to recognize value in unexpected places. He examined the windmill closely, noting the quality of the metalwork and the way the glass pieces created patterns of colored light as they spun. "This is fine work," Jacob announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen craftsmanship across 3 territories. "Folk art like this sells well in the eastern cities. People there pay good money for handmade pieces with character." Ruby froze at the stranger's voice, but Wade placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is Ruby's creation," Wade said. "She designed it, and her hands did most of the assembly." Jacob studied Ruby with new interest. "The blind girl? I heard about her from the stable owner." He turned back to the windmill, his assessment taking on a more serious tone. "Would you be willing to make more of these? I could offer you fair payment for pieces of this quality." The question stunned Ruby into silence. She'd never imagined that anything she created might have value to someone else, especially someone willing to pay money for it. "How much would be fair?" Wade asked, stepping in when Ruby couldn't find her voice. "For a piece like this?" $2, Jacob replied. "3 if you can make them larger or more elaborate." $2 represented more money than Ruby had ever held at one time. The sum was enough to buy food for weeks, enough to purchase real supplies instead of hoping to find them discarded. "We'll think about it," Wade said, recognizing that Ruby needed time to process the offer. After Jacob moved on to conduct his other business in town, Ruby sat quietly beside her spinning creation. The gentle sound of the windmill seemed different now, not just beautiful, but valuable in ways she was still trying to understand. "People would really pay money for things I make?" she asked finally. "Jacob's been trading for 20 years, Wade replied. "He knows what sells and what doesn't. If he's interested in your work, other people will be too." The idea thrilled and terrified Ruby in equal measure. Creating beautiful things for their own sake had brought her joy she'd never experienced. But the thought of others judging her work, of depending on her creations for survival, added pressure she wasn't sure she could handle. "What if I can't make them good enough?" Ruby asked. "What if you can?" Wade countered. "What if this is the thing you were meant to do all along?" They spent the rest of the afternoon working on their 4th windmill, this one incorporating techniques they'd learned from their earlier attempts. Ruby found herself suggesting modifications, ways to improve the balance, methods for making the tin pieces catch more wind, ideas for arranging the glass so the colors would blend more attractively. By evening, they'd created something that surpassed even their own expectations. The windmill stood nearly 3 feet tall, its elaborate framework supporting dozens of carefully shaped tin blades. Pieces of blue and green glass caught the late sunlight, throwing patterns of color across the dusty ground. Mrs. Henley emerged from her store as they were admiring their work. She'd been watching their progress throughout the day, her practical nature warring with something she was reluctant to acknowledge. "That's quite a contraption," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "It's art," Wade replied simply. "Ruby's art." Mrs. Henley studied the windmill with the assessing eye of someone who understood commerce. Jacob seemed interested in it. "He offered to buy pieces like this," Wade confirmed. "And you'd split the money with Ruby?" The question surprised Wade. It's Ruby's work. The money would be Ruby's. Mrs. Henley nodded slowly, as if this arrangement made sense to her in ways she hadn't expected. I suppose she could display 1 or 2 pieces in my store. See if any other travelers show interest. The offer represented a significant shift in the storekeeper's attitude toward Ruby. From beggar to potential business partner was a leap that Mrs. Henley was making more readily than anyone might have predicted. "That's very generous," Wade said. "It's practical," Mrs. Henley corrected, though her tone suggested the offer came from more than simple business sense. Good craftswork deserves proper presentation. Ruby beamed at the praise, her hands already reaching for materials to start another creation. Within 2 weeks, Ruby's corner in Mrs. Henley's general store had become the most talked-about display in Hollow Creek. The mosaic picture frame she'd created from fragments of broken mirror drew visitors from 3 towns over. Its carefully arranged pieces creating a kaleidoscope effect that shifted with the viewing angle. Ruby had discovered the mirror fragments behind the old boarding house, scattered remnants of what had once been an elegant-looking glass. Where others saw dangerous shards fit only for disposal, her fingers had felt the potential for something beautiful. Working with Wade's patient guidance, she'd learned to arrange the pieces so their edges caught light from different directions, creating patterns that seemed to dance and change. "It's like looking into a fairy tale," whispered young Timothy Crawford, whose mother had brought him to see the strange artwork created by the blind girl. Ruby overheard the comment from her position behind the counter, where she was carefully sorting a new collection of findings, and smiled at the wonder in the boy's voice. The frame had sold within days to a rancher's wife who'd driven 30 miles specifically to see Ruby's work. The $3 it brought represented more money than Ruby had ever possessed, but more importantly, it proved that her creations could move people in ways she was only beginning to understand. Wade taught her to keep careful records of their sales, showing her how to track expenses against income and plan for future purchases of materials. Ruby's quick mind absorbed the basic principles of commerce with the same intensity she'd brought to learning artistic techniques. "Business is about trust," Wade explained as Ruby practiced counting coins by feel. "People need to believe they're getting fair value for their money, and we need to deliver what we promise." Ruby nodded seriously, understanding that her reputation would depend on the quality and reliability of her work. She'd begun developing her own standards, rejecting pieces that didn't meet her, increasingly demanding requirements for craftsmanship and beauty. Their workspace had expanded beyond Ruby's original shelter. Mrs. Henley had cleared a corner of her storage room where Ruby and Wade could work during bad weather, and the townspeople had grown accustomed to the sound of careful tapping and soft conversation that marked their daily sessions. Doc Harrison had become a regular visitor, bringing news of potential customers and occasionally contributing items from his own collection of medical oddities. A brass stethoscope that no longer functioned medically became the centerpiece for an elaborate wind chime that produced hauntingly beautiful tones. "You've got healing in your hands," Doc told Ruby as they listened to the chime's gentle music. "Different kind than mine, but just as real." The compliment pleased Ruby more than she could express. For the first time in her life, she felt valued for something she could contribute rather than pitied for what she lacked. Sheriff Clayton had begun stopping by their workspace as well, though his visit seemed motivated more by curiosity than official business. Ruby sensed the lawman's gradual shift from suspicion to grudging respect. Though he remained careful to maintain his professional distance. "Folks are talking," Sheriff Clayton mentioned to Wade one afternoon, "saying Ruby's got some kind of gift for finding things that belong to people." Wade looked up from the delicate wirework he was helping Ruby shape. "She's always been good at locating lost items. Mrs. Patterson found her wedding ring in one of Ruby's collections last week," the sheriff continued. "Ring she lost 2 years ago when they were packing to leave town. Ruby just handed it over, wouldn't take any reward." Ruby had indeed returned the ring without hesitation, though she'd been sorry to lose such a beautiful piece from her collection. The simple gold band had called to her from beneath a pile of leaves behind the abandoned Patterson house, and her fingers had immediately recognized its quality and significance. "Lost things want to go home," Ruby said. Simply, Sheriff Clayton studied her with the puzzled expression of someone trying to understand something that defied logical explanation. "How do you know which things are lost and which things are thrown away?" Ruby paused in her work, considering how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "Thrown away things feel empty, like all the caring has been taken out of them. Lost things still hold love." The explanation seemed to satisfy Sheriff Clayton, who nodded, as if Ruby's distinction made perfect sense to him. "Well, you've made Mrs. Patterson very happy." She'd given up hope of ever seeing that ring again. These moments of recognition from the community meant as much to Ruby as the money from her sales. After years of being invisible, she was discovering what it felt like to be valued, to be seen as someone who contributed rather than someone who merely survived. Wade watched these interactions with pride tempered by growing concern. Ruby's success was attracting attention beyond Hollow Creek, and not all of it felt benign. Letters had begun arriving at the general store from dealers and collectors who'd heard about the blind girl's unusual artwork. Some of the offers seemed generous, but others carried undertones that made Wade uneasy. "Someone wants to buy everything I make for the next year," Ruby reported after Mrs. Henley had read her the latest correspondence. "Says he'll pay in advance." Wade frowned at the letter's formal language and legal terminology. Exclusive contracts and advance payments often benefited buyers more than artists, especially artists who didn't fully understand the terms they were accepting. "What do you think about that?" Wade asked carefully. Ruby considered the question with the seriousness she'd learned to bring to business decisions. "I think I want to keep choosing who gets my work. Some people understand what I'm trying to make, and some people just want to own something unusual." Her instinctive understanding of the difference impressed Wade. Ruby might be young and inexperienced in business matters, but her sensitivity to people's motivations served as an effective guide to their intentions. "Then we'll keep making pieces for people who appreciate them," Wade agreed. "Money's important, but it's not the only thing that matters." Ruby smiled and returned to her work on the mosaic frame, her fingers carefully positioning each fragment of mirror so it would catch and reflect light in harmony with its neighbors. The piece was nearly complete, and she could sense that it would be one of her finest creations yet. Outside, the wind caught one of their earlier windmills, sending colored light dancing across the wall. The gentle spinning sound had become so familiar to the townspeople that its absence would now seem wrong, as if some essential music had gone missing from their daily lives. Ruby had found her place in the world, and the world had begun to reshape itself around her presence. The brass compass rose had been calling to Ruby for 3 days before she finally located it. Buried beneath a pile of rotting boards behind the old surveyor's office, the broken navigation instrument spoke to her fingers of journeys taken and destinations never reached. One of its cardinal points had snapped off, and the face was cracked, but Ruby could feel the quality of the craftsmanship. Beneath the damage, she was working on restoring the compass when Augustus Blackwood arrived in Hollow Creek. His polished carriage and matched horses announced prosperity. Before he even stepped down to the dusty street, everything about the man spoke of wealth and authority. From his tailored coat to the gold chain across his vest to the way he surveyed the town as if calculating its value. "I'm here to see the artist," Blackwood announced to Mrs. Henley, his cultured Eastern accent cutting through the general store's familiar atmosphere like a blade through silk. Mrs. Henley had grown protective of Ruby over the past weeks, and something in Blackwood's manner immediately raised her defenses. "Ruby's working," she replied curtly. "You'll need to wait your turn like everyone else." But Blackwood wasn't accustomed to waiting. He produced a leather portfolio filled with documents and recommendations, spreading them across Mrs. Henley's counter with the confidence of a man closing a business deal. "I represent several collectors who've heard remarkable things about the girl's work," he explained. I'm prepared to offer her opportunities that could secure her future. Wade emerged from the storage room at the sound of unfamiliar voices, Ruby close behind him. She carried the compass rose carefully, her fingers still exploring its damaged surface as she listened to the conversation. "Ah, there she is," Blackwood said, his tone shifting to the careful brightness people often used when speaking to children or invalids. "Ruby, isn't it? I've come a very long way to meet you." Ruby's posture stiffened at his tone, but she responded with the politeness Wade had taught her. "Good afternoon, sir." Blackwood approached their workspace with the assessing eye of a man who understood value in monetary terms. He examined several of Ruby's pieces, his expression revealing professional appreciation mixed with calculation. "Remarkable work," he pronounced. "Quite remarkable for someone so young and—" He paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Challenged." The word hung in the air like smoke from a badly tended fire. Wade felt Ruby tense beside him, and his own jaw tightened at the casual dismissal implicit in Blackwood's choice of language. "Ruby's not challenged," Wade said quietly. "She's talented." Of course," Blackwood agreed quickly. "I meant no offense. In fact, her unique situation makes her work even more valuable to my clients. The story behind the art, the blind orphan creating beauty from refuse, that's exactly the kind of narrative that captures wealthy buyers' imaginations." Ruby's hands stilled on the compass rose. The idea that her blindness and history would be used to sell her art troubled her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She'd begun to hope that people valued her work for its own merit, not as a curiosity created by a damaged child. "What exactly are you offering?" Wade asked, though his tone suggested limited patience for whatever answer might come. Blackwood opened his portfolio with flourish, revealing contracts and bank drafts that represented more money than most people in Hollow Creek would see in their lifetimes. "Exclusive representation," he explained. "Ruby would create pieces solely for my clients, who would pay premium prices for original work. I'm prepared to advance her $1,000 against future commissions." The sum staggered everyone present. Mrs. Henley's eyes widened despite her suspicions, and even Wade couldn't hide his surprise at the magnitude of the offer. $1,000, Ruby whispered. "Just the beginning," Blackwood assured her. "My clients pay handsomely for unique pieces. Within a year, you could be earning more than most working men see in a decade." The offer was generous, almost to the point of impossibility. Wade's experience with such arrangements had taught him that when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was. What would exclusive representation mean for Ruby's day-to-day life? Wade asked. "Oh, she'd be well cared for," Blackwood replied. "I maintain workshops in Philadelphia where my artists work under ideal conditions. Ruby would have access to the finest materials, experienced assistants, and proper living quarters." The more Blackwood talked, the more uncomfortable Ruby became. The vision he painted sounded luxurious, but somehow hollow, as if her art would become just another product manufactured for wealthy consumers who would never understand the love and care that went into each piece. "Would I still be able to live here?" Ruby asked quietly. "Why would you want to?" Blackwood's question carried genuine bewilderment. "Philadelphia offers so much more than this." He gestured dismissively at the simple store around them. "Frontier settlement." Ruby's fingers found the compass rose again, tracing its broken surface as if seeking direction from its damaged points. The instrument had been created to help travelers find their way, but its fractured state made it unreliable for navigation. She wondered if accepting Blackwood's offer would leave her equally lost. He pointed toward destinations that might not lead her home. "I need time to think about it," Ruby said finally. Blackwood's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He was clearly accustomed to quicker decisions and more enthusiastic acceptance of his generous offers. "Of course," he said smoothly, "though I should mention that my clients are eager to begin commissioning work immediately. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." The subtle pressure in his words wasn't lost on anyone present. Wade recognized the negotiating tactic, create urgency to force hasty decisions that might not be in the other party's best interest. After Blackwood departed to arrange lodging at the boarding house, Ruby sat quietly with the compass rose in her hands. The broken navigation instrument seemed to reflect her own situation, offered a clear direction that might not lead where she truly wanted to go. "What do you think?" Ruby asked Wade finally. Wade considered his words carefully, knowing that his answer would influence a decision that could reshape Ruby's entire future. "I think you should trust your instincts," he said. "Your hands have never led you wrong when it comes to understanding value." Ruby nodded slowly, her fingers continuing to explore the compass rose's damaged surface. Somewhere in its broken points and cracked face, she hoped to find the guidance she needed to navigate the most important decision of her young life. The town council meeting had been called for the following evening, ostensibly to discuss municipal improvements, but everyone understood the real topic would be Ruby's growing prominence and the questions it raised about Hollow Creek's future. Ruby discovered the leather-bound journal by accident. She'd been reorganizing their expanded workspace in Mrs. Henley's storage room when her fingers found the small book wedged behind a loose board in the wall. The leather was soft with age and wear, and something about its weight and texture told her it contained important secrets. Wade had stepped out to negotiate with a supplier about wire and tin, leaving Ruby alone with her curiosity and the mysterious journal. Her fingers found the clasp easily, and the book fell open to reveal pages covered with careful handwriting that her touch could not decipher. But tucked between the pages were items she could identify: pressed flowers, a small photograph, and what felt like military insignia. When Wade returned 20 minutes later, he found Ruby sitting quietly with the journal in her lap, her expression troubled and thoughtful. "That's mine," Wade said quietly, recognizing the book immediately. "I know," Ruby replied. "I wasn't trying to read your private things. It was just hidden behind the wall, and I thought maybe someone had lost it." Wade approached slowly, as if the journal might explode if handled carelessly. Ruby held it out to him, but he didn't immediately take it. "There are things in there that might change how you think about me," Wade said carefully. "What kinds of things?" Wade settled beside her, accepting the journal but not opening it. For a long moment, he sat in silence, weighing words he'd never expected to have to speak. "I wasn't entirely honest when I told you who I was," he began. "My name is Wade Thorne, but that's not the only name I've carried. For 15 years, I was Captain Wade Thorne of the United States Cavalry." Ruby's hands stilled in her lap. Whatever she'd expected Wade to reveal, military service wasn't it. "I commanded a unit responsible for—" Wade paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "We were supposed to maintain peace between settlers and the Apache tribes, but peace meant different things to different people." Wade opened the journal carefully, finding a page that contained orders written in official military language. Though Ruby couldn't read the words, she could feel the tension in Wade's posture as he looked at them. There was a settlement of Apache families camped near a spring that some ranchers wanted for their cattle, Wade continued. "My orders were to relocate the families, by force if necessary. The families included children, babies really, children who'd done nothing wrong except be born Apache." Ruby listened with the complete attention she gave to all of Wade's explanations, sensing that this story would help her understand things about him that had puzzled her. "I refused the order," Wade said simply. "Told my commanding officer that moving those families would be tantamount to murder. They had no supplies for winter travel, and there was nowhere safe for them to go." "What happened?" "I was court-martialed for insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer," Wade replied. "Spent 2 years in military prison. By the time I got out, my wife had taken our daughter and moved back east. Said she couldn't be married to a man who'd chosen strangers over his own family's security." The revelation hit Ruby like a physical blow. Wade's kindness toward her suddenly took on different dimensions. He wasn't just a drifter who'd happened to notice her talent. He was a man who'd lost his own family because he'd tried to protect someone else's children. "You saved those Apache children?" Ruby asked. "I tried to," Wade corrected. Another unit was sent to complete the mission after I was removed. The families were relocated in the middle of winter. Most of them didn't survive the journey. Ruby absorbed this information in silence, her fingers tracing patterns on the journal's worn cover. The story explained so much about Wade's careful protectiveness, his immediate understanding of her situation, his willingness to see value where others saw only problems. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked finally. "Because I reminded you of those children you couldn't save?" Wade was quiet for so long that Ruby wondered if he'd heard the question. When he finally answered, his voice carried years of guilt and hope in equal measure. "At first, maybe," he admitted, "but that changed quickly. I helped those Apache families because it was right. But I help you because you're Ruby, because you're talented and kind and deserving of every good thing this world can offer." Ruby felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she couldn't have explained why. Wade's honesty about his motivations hurt and healed simultaneously. "Do you still think about your daughter?" Ruby asked. Wade's hand found the photograph tucked between the journal's pages. "Every day. She'd be about your age now if she—" He stopped himself before finishing the thought. "If she what?" "If she's still alive," Wade said quietly. "I lost track of them after they moved east. Don't even know if my wife remarried, if they kept my name, if they'd want to hear from me after all these years." The pain in his voice made Ruby's chest ache. She'd always known Wade carried some deep sadness, but she'd imagined it was about lost opportunities or failed dreams, not about a family torn apart by his conscience and their inability to understand his choice. "What was her name?" Ruby asked gently. "Emma," Wade replied, his voice catching slightly on the syllable. "Emma Rose Thorne. She had your curiosity, your quick mind. Would have loved watching you work with your hands." Ruby reached out tentatively, finding Wade's hand and covering it with her own small fingers. "Maybe she still could," she suggested quietly. Wade looked at her with surprise. "What do you mean?" "Maybe your family would understand better now. Maybe time has helped them see that you did the right thing, even if it cost everyone so much." The possibility had occurred to Wade countless times over the years, but he'd never allowed himself to hope seriously that reconciliation might be possible. The shame of his imprisonment, the years of silence, the possibility that his wife and daughter might be happier without him, all of it seemed to argue against attempting contact. "Or maybe they've built a good life without me," Wade said. "Maybe reaching out would just cause them pain they've finally gotten past." Ruby considered this carefully. "Do you think you'll ever stop loving them?" "Never," Wade replied without hesitation. "Then maybe they haven't stopped loving you either. Maybe they're just waiting for you to come home." The conversation was interrupted by Sheriff Clayton's arrival, his expression grim and purposeful in a way that immediately put both Ruby and Wade on alert. "Wade, I need to speak with you privately," the sheriff said. "Anything you need to say can be said in front of Ruby," Wade replied. His protective instincts immediately engaged. Sheriff Clayton glanced at Ruby, then back to Wade. "I received a telegram this morning. Someone's been asking questions about a former cavalry captain named Wade Thorne. Someone with enough authority to get official cooperation." Wade felt the familiar weight of his past settling back onto his shoulders. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests someone's tracked you here and wants to know about your current activities," Sheriff Clayton replied. "The telegram mentioned your association with a local girl and asked about any business arrangements you might have." "Maid!" Ruby's hand tightened on Wade's. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered. Wade nodded grimly. Augustus Blackwood's arrival had seemed too convenient, his interest in Ruby too intense for simple commercial motivation. Now the pieces began forming a picture that made Wade's stomach turn. "How much time do we have?" Wade asked. "Hard to say," Sheriff Clayton replied. "Could be days, could be hours. But Wade, if someone's coming for you, they might not make distinctions about who gets hurt in the process." Ruby understood the implication immediately. Wade's past had found him just as her future was beginning to take shape, and whatever happened next might destroy both their chances for the happiness they'd started to build together. The town council meeting was set for 7 o'clock, But by 6:30, the small assembly hall above the general store was already crowded with more people than it had seen in years. Word had spread about Augustus Blackwood's offer to Ruby, and the implications for Hollow Creek's future had stirred discussions that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Ruby sat in their workspace below, carefully polishing a small golden thimble she'd discovered among Wade's possessions. The delicate sewing tool bore intricate engravings around its rim, tiny roses and leaves that spoke of love and attention to detail. When she'd found it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his saddlebags, Wade had gone completely still. "That belonged to my wife," he'd said quietly. "She used it when she sewed Emma's dresses. I kept it after they left, thinking maybe someday I could return it to her." Now, Ruby held the thimble like a talisman, its warm gold surface smooth under her fingertips. The small object represented everything Wade had lost: his family, his honor, his place in a world that demanded impossible choices from good men. But it also represented something else: the enduring nature of love, even across years of separation and silence. "They're getting loud up there," Wade observed, nodding toward the ceiling, where the rumble of conversation grew increasingly animated. "Are you worried?" Ruby asked. Wade considered the question seriously. Over the past 2 days, since Sheriff Clayton's warning about the telegram, they'd discussed various possibilities for handling whatever confrontation was coming. None of the options seemed particularly appealing. "I'm worried about you," Wade replied honestly. "I came to this town carrying my own troubles, and now they're affecting your life in ways you don't deserve." Ruby set down the thimble and turned toward him with the directness that always surprised adults who expected children to be less perceptive. "Wade, do you think I'd be better off if you'd never come to Hollow Creek?" The question forced Wade to confront something he'd been avoiding. Before his arrival, Ruby had been surviving, but not truly living. She'd been collecting treasures, but not understanding their value. She'd been existing on the margins of a community that barely acknowledged her presence. "No," he said finally. "I think we both needed to find each other." "Then stop talking about your troubles affecting my life," Ruby said firmly. "Your troubles are my troubles now. That's what families do." The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither had quite acknowledged before. Family. Not the legal relationship that adoption papers might create, but the deeper bond that had formed through shared work, mutual respect and genuine care. "Is that what we are?" Wade asked gently. "Family? Aren't we?" Ruby replied. "You've taught me more about who I am and what I can do than anyone else ever has. You've protected me and believed in me and helped me find my place in the world. If that's not family, what is?" Wade felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of guilt and loneliness he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Ruby was right. They had become family in all the ways that mattered. And families faced difficulties together, rather than allowing one member to shoulder burdens alone. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together," Wade said, his voice carrying new resolve. Ruby smiled and picked up the golden thimble again. "Tell me more about Emma. What was she like when she was little?" Wade leaned back against the wall, letting memories he'd kept carefully locked away resurface. "Curious, like you. She wanted to understand how everything worked. Clocks, music boxes, even the way flour turned into bread. My wife used to joke that Emma asked more questions before breakfast than most people asked in a week." "Did she like making things with her hands?" "Loved it," Wade replied. "She was always building something. Houses for her dolls, corrals for her toy horses, elaborate castles from kitchen pots and wooden spoons. She had this way of seeing possibilities in ordinary objects that reminded me of—" He paused, realizing the comparison he was about to make. "Of me?" Ruby suggested. "Of you," Wade confirmed. "I think you and Emma would have been great friends." Ruby turned the thimble slowly in her fingers, feeling the delicate engravings that Wade's wife had looked at while sewing their daughter's clothes. "Maybe we still will be. What do you mean?" Ruby had been thinking about this possibility since Wade had shared his story. "After we get through whatever's happening tonight, maybe we could try to find them." Maybe it's time for you to go home. The suggestion terrified and thrilled Wade in equal measure. The years had given him perspective on his choices, but they'd also given him more reasons to doubt whether his family would welcome his return. "What if they don't want to see me?" he asked. "What if they do?" Ruby countered, echoing his earlier advice about her own fears. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henley's arrival downstairs. The storekeeper looked harried and concerned, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks under the pressure of the evening's events. "It's time," she announced. "They're ready for you both upstairs." Wade stood and offered Ruby his arm, but she shook her head. "I need to do this on my own," she said. "People have to see that I can stand up for myself." Mrs. Henley looked at Ruby with new respect. Over the past weeks, she'd watched the blind girl transform from a charity case into a young woman with opinions and the courage to express them. "Before we go up," Mrs. Henley said, "there's something you both should know. Augustus Blackwood received another telegram this afternoon. He's been asking Sheriff Clayton questions about Wade's background, and he's made it clear that his offer to Ruby comes with conditions about her current associations." Wade felt anger building in his chest. "He's using Ruby to get at me." "It appears so," Mrs. Henley confirmed. "But Ruby's got more support up there than you might expect. Doc Harrison's been talking to people, and some folks are starting to understand what Ruby's brought to this community." Ruby clutched the golden thimble tighter, drawing strength from its connection to Wade's lost family and the love it represented. "Are you ready?" she asked Wade. "Are you?" he replied. Ruby thought about everything that had brought them to this moment, her years of survival, Wade's sacrifice and exile, their discovery of each other, and the partnership they'd built from mutual need and growing affection. Whatever happened in the room upstairs would determine whether they could continue building their unlikely family or whether the past would tear apart the future they'd begun to envision. "I'm ready," she said, firmly. They climbed the narrow stairs together, Wade's hand resting lightly on Ruby's shoulder for guidance. Though they both knew she could navigate the familiar route perfectly well on her own. The gesture was about comfort rather than assistance, a reminder that they would face whatever came next as a team. The assembly hall fell quiet as they entered. Ruby could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, some curious, some hostile, some sympathetic. But somewhere in the crowd, she sensed support from people who had begun to see her as more than the blind beggar girl who'd once existed on their community's margins. Augustus Blackwood sat in the front row, his posture confident and expectant. Sheriff Clayton stood near the door, his hand resting casually on his weapon in the way of a man prepared for trouble. Doc Harrison had claimed a seat near the center of the room, his medical bag at his feet and his expression, suggesting he was ready to treat whatever wounds this evening might produce. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just Ruby and Wade's future, but the character of Hollow Creek itself. In her pocket, Ruby's fingers found the golden thimble one more time, drawing strength from its promise that love could endure even the longest separations and the most difficult circumstances. Whatever happened next, she would meet it with the courage Wade had helped her discover and the skills they'd developed together. She was no longer just a survivor. She was an artist, a member of the community, and part of a family worth fighting for. Ruby carried her speaking stone, a smooth river rock she'd found weeks earlier, clutched tightly in her left hand. The stone had become her anchor during difficult conversations, its polished surface worn smooth by countless years of water and time. Wade had taught her that speaking to groups required both courage and focus, and the stone helped her find both. Mayor Henderson called the meeting to order with unnecessary formality, his voice carrying the nervous energy of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. The assembled crowd included nearly every adult in Hollow Creek, their faces reflecting the full spectrum of opinion about the evening's agenda. "We're here to discuss the situation concerning Ruby and her." Mayor Henderson paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing, recent business activities. Augustus Blackwood rose immediately, his tailored coat and confident bearing marking him as the most prosperous person in the room. If I may, Mayor Henderson, I believe I can clarify the situation for everyone. Ruby felt Wade tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. They'd agreed that she would speak first, before Blackwood could shape the discussion to his advantage. Actually, Ruby said, rising from her chair with careful dignity, I'd like to speak first. This meeting is about me, so I think I should be the one to explain my situation. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Many of the townspeople had rarely heard Ruby speak at all, let alone address a group with such confidence. Ruby moved to the front of the room, her fingers trailing along the wall for guidance, but her posture straight and self-assured. The speaking stone remained steady in her hand, its familiar weight grounding her as she faced the assembled community. "My name is Ruby," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small room. "I've lived in Hollow Creek for 12 years, since I was born here during the big blizzard. Most of you know me as the blind girl who collects things from your trash." She paused, letting her words settle. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering times they'd ignored her presence or spoken about her as if she couldn't hear. "I want to tell you about what I've been doing with those things you threw away," Ruby continued, "and why it matters to all of us." Ruby began describing her collection systematically, explaining how her fingers could identify quality and craftsmanship that eyes often missed. She talked about the weather vane that had taught her about beauty hidden beneath damage, and the silver locket that had shown her the difference between discarded and lost. "Mrs. Patterson," Ruby said, turning toward where she knew the woman was sitting, "when I found your wedding ring, I could feel that it still held love. That's how I knew it belonged to someone who would want it back." Mrs. Patterson's voice came softly from the crowd. "I'd given up hope of ever seeing that ring again. Ruby, you gave me back something I thought was lost forever." Ruby nodded and continued. "That's when I began to understand what I was really doing. I wasn't just collecting trash. I was gathering pieces of our town's history, things that connected us to better times, to the people who came before us, to the dreams we used to have." The crowd was listening intently now, their initial skepticism giving way to genuine attention. Ruby's description of her work resonated with people who remembered when Hollow Creek had been more prosperous, more hopeful. "Wade taught me that I could do more than just find these treasures," Ruby said, her voice growing stronger. "He showed me how to clean them, repair them, and turn them into new, beautiful things. But he didn't create my ability to find value in what others discarded." "That gift was always mine," Augustus Blackwood interrupted, his patience finally exhausted. "This is all very touching, but the girl is clearly being exploited by a man with questionable credentials and criminal associations. My offer provides her with legitimate opportunities and proper supervision." Ruby turned toward Blackwood's voice, her unseeing eyes somehow managing to fix on him with unsettling accuracy. "Mr. Blackwood, you've made me a generous offer, but I have some questions about it." "Of course, child. Ask whatever you'd like." "Would I be able to continue returning lost items to their owners?" Blackwood's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "My clients are interested in original artwork, not would I be able to choose which pieces to create and which materials to use." "Well, naturally there would be some guidance about market preferences. Would I be able to come home to visit Hollow Creek whenever I wanted?" This time Blackwood's pause was longer. "Philadelphia offers so many opportunities that you'd hardly miss this place." Ruby nodded slowly, as if Blackwood's evasive answers had confirmed something she'd suspected. "Thank you for clarifying your offer, Mr. Blackwood. Now I'd like to tell everyone what I've decided." The room fell completely silent, everyone understanding that they were about to witness a moment that would change Ruby's life and, by extension, their community's future. In her hand, the speaking stone grew warm from her grip, its smooth surface absorbing the heat of her determination. Ruby reached into the cloth bag at her side and began removing items one by one, placing them carefully on the table in front of the assembled crowd. Each piece clinked or thudded softly as it joined the growing collection, and the townspeople leaned forward with growing curiosity and recognition. "These are the contents of Hollow Creek's time capsule," Ruby announced, her voice carrying across the now silent room. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. The time capsule had been buried 25 years earlier, during the town's most hopeful period, but its location had been lost when the surveyor who'd overseen the burial died in a riding accident. People had searched for it periodically over the years, but eventually gave up hope of recovery. "Mrs. Henley," Ruby said, holding up a brass key with an ornate handle, "this is from your family's original store, isn't it? The one that burned down 15 years ago?" Mrs. Henley rose slowly from her seat, her face pale with recognition. "That's impossible. That key was buried with the capsule, along with a photograph of the original store and my mother's recipe book." Ruby smiled and produced both items. The photograph, showing a thriving business establishment and a small leather-bound book filled with handwritten recipes. "I found them scattered behind different buildings over the past 2 years. My hands told me they belonged together, but I didn't understand why until recently." Doc Harrison stood up, his medical training making him skeptical of coincidence. "Ruby, how did you find pieces of a buried time capsule spread across town?" "The flood," Ruby replied simply. 3 years ago, when the creek overflowed its banks, it must have washed out the capsule and scattered its contents. But I could feel that these things belonged to Hollow Creek, belonged to all of us together." She continued, removing items from her bag. A child's drawing of the town, as it was meant to become, with railroad tracks and grand buildings, a list of families who'd lived there in better times, a small American flag that had flown over the original settlement, pressed flowers from the prairie in its unspoiled state. Each piece called to me, because it held the dreams and memories of people who loved this place, Ruby explained. "I've been gathering our history without even knowing it, preserving the story of who we used to be and who we hoped to become." Augustus Blackwood's confident demeanor was beginning to crack. "This is all very sentimental, but it doesn't change the practical realities of the girl's situation. She needs proper guidance, and she needs her family," Wade interrupted, standing up beside Ruby. "And her family needs her." Sheriff Clayton cleared his throat from his position near the door. "Since we're talking about family and practical realities, maybe Mr. Blackwood would like to explain why he's been asking questions about Wade's military service." All eyes turned to Blackwood, whose composure finally abandoned him completely. "I was merely conducting due diligence on the people influencing this valuable young artist." "Valuable," Wade repeated quietly. "That's all she is to you, isn't it? A curiosity to be exploited." Ruby stepped forward, still holding the speaking stone that had given her courage. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your offer, but I'm declining it." "You're making a mistake," Blackwood said sharply, his diplomatic veneer falling away. "This town offers you nothing. These people will use you until your novelty wears off, then forget you exist." "These people are my neighbors," Ruby replied firmly. "They're the ones who will remember my name when I'm gone and teach their children about the things I've made. That matters more to me than money." Doc Harrison stood again, his voice carrying the authority of his years and his standing in the community. "I'd like to make a proposal. Ruby's work has brought attention to our town, but more importantly, it's brought us together as a community. I think we should establish a proper heritage museum with Ruby as its curator." The suggestion sparked immediate discussion throughout the room. People began talking about items they had that might belong in such a museum, about stories they remembered from better times, about possibilities they hadn't considered in years. Mrs. Henley raised her voice above the conversation. "I'll donate the back room of my store as space for the museum, and I'll match whatever the town council can provide for Ruby's salary. And I'll help with the legal arrangements," added Mayor Henderson, surprising everyone with his decisiveness. "Ruby's proven she understands this town's history better than any of us." Augustus Blackwood gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. "You're all making a tremendous mistake. This girl could have had a real future." "She already has a real future," Wade said quietly. Here with people who care about her as a person, not just as a source of profit. Ruby smiled and placed the time capsule contents back in her bag. The town's buried treasures had found their way home just as she had. Sometimes the most valuable things were hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting for the right person to recognize their worth. 6 months later, the hand-carved wooden sign reading Hollow Creek Heritage Museum caught the morning light as Ruby ran her fingers over its carefully crafted letters. Wade had spent weeks creating the sign, teaching her each step of the wood-carving process until her hands could shape letters as confidently as they shaped metal and wire. The elegant script carried the weight of permanence, announcing to the world that this place and its treasures would endure. The museum occupied not just the back room of Mrs. Henley's store, but had expanded to include the entire second floor and a workshop area where Ruby continued creating her wind sculptures and restored artifacts. What had begun as a simple display corner had grown into something that drew visitors from across the territory, families from neighboring towns, traveling merchants who'd heard about the blind curator and her remarkable collection, even scholars from the territorial university who were documenting frontier settlement patterns. Ruby stood behind the main display case, organizing a new acquisition that had arrived the previous day. A traveling family had stopped specifically to donate a daguerreotype of Hollow Creek from its earliest days, having heard about the museum through word of mouth that had spread across 3 counties. The photograph showed the town as it had been in its most hopeful period. Neat houses, busy streets, children playing in yards that spoke of prosperity and dreams. Another busy morning, observed Mrs. Henley, entering the museum with the Daily Mail. She'd grown to enjoy the steady stream of visitors, and her general store had benefited considerably from the increased traffic. The woman who'd once reluctantly allowed Ruby a corner for her creations now served as the museum's unofficial business manager, handling correspondence and visitor logistics with the efficiency of someone who'd found renewed purpose. Mrs. Patterson brought her grandmother's china set, Ruby reported, carefully arranging the delicate pieces in protective display holders. And the Johnson family contributed a surveyor's compass from when the railroad men first came through. They said it belonged to the man who originally mapped the town boundaries. Mrs. Henley sorted through the letters, most of which were addressed to Ruby or the museum. The Daily Mail had become substantial enough to require its own sorting system. "You've got another inquiry from that newspaper in Denver. They want to write a feature story about your work. And there's a letter from the territorial governor's office, something about recognizing the museum's contributions to historical preservation." Ruby smiled, but shook her head at the newspaper request. "I'd rather spend the time working than talking about working, but the governor's letter sounds important. Would you read it to me later?" The museum had brought changes to Hollow Creek that extended far beyond Ruby's personal situation. Property values had begun rising as people recognized the town's potential for heritage tourism. Several families who'd left years earlier had returned, drawn by news of the community's revival and the opportunities it presented. The railroad, while still not interested in running tracks through Hollow Creek, had begun scheduling regular stagecoach connections to bring visitors to what regional newspapers had started. Calling the Miracle Museum new, businesses had opened to serve the increased traffic. There's a small hotel run by a couple from Denver, a cafe that specialized in frontier-style cooking, and a leather goods shop that sold items crafted by local artisans, inspired by Ruby's example. The town that had once been dying from neglect was now thriving with renewed energy and purpose. Doc Harrison arrived for his daily visit, carrying his medical bag and a cup of coffee from the new cafe that had opened across the street. At 72, he'd found new vitality in his role as the museum's unofficial medical consultant, helping Ruby understand the historical context of medical artifacts and sharing stories of frontier healthcare that fascinated visitors. "How are our patients today?" he asked, nodding toward the restoration area where several damaged artifacts awaited Ruby's attention. His habit of discussing restoration work in medical terms had become one of the museum's charming traditions. "The candlesticks are responding well to treatment," Ruby replied, playing along with the familiar routine. "But that music box is going to need surgery. The spring mechanism is more damaged than we initially thought." Wade emerged from the workshop carrying a delicate wind chime he'd been helping Ruby assemble. The piece incorporated elements from throughout the museum's collection, a fragment of stained glass from the old church, small bells from a child's toy, and metalwork that showed the influence of techniques Ruby had developed over months of experimentation. Each element had been chosen not just for its beauty, but for its connection to Hollow Creek's history. "This one's ready for testing," Wade announced, hanging the chime near an open window where the morning breeze could reach it. The soft, harmonious tones that resulted drew approving nods from everyone present. Ruby had developed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how different materials and shapes produced various sounds, and her wind chimes had become particularly popular with visitors. Each piece seemed to capture something essential about the prairie wind, and the enduring spirit of the people who'd chosen to make their lives in this challenging landscape. "Beautiful work," Doc Harrison said, settling into the chair they designated as his during these morning visits. "You two make quite a team." The comment carried implications that everyone in the room understood, but rarely discussed directly. Over the months, Wade and Ruby's partnership had evolved into something that looked increasingly like a permanent family arrangement. Wade had officially become Ruby's guardian through territorial legal proceedings, and they'd established a household in the small apartment above the museum. Their relationship had deepened from mutual need into genuine affection and shared purpose. Ruby had begun teaching other children about finding value in discarded things, holding weekly sessions where youngsters from town learned to see potential in broken objects and forgotten treasures. Wade assisted with these classes, sharing his knowledge of materials and restoration techniques, while Ruby guided the children's developing artistic sensibilities. "Speaking of teams," Wade said, producing a letter from his jacket pocket with hands that trembled slightly. "We received something interesting yesterday." Ruby could hear the carefully controlled excitement in his voice, mixed with an undercurrent of nervousness that made her pay closer attention. "What kind of interesting?" "A letter from Philadelphia," Wade replied, "but not from anyone trying to buy your artwork." Ruby's hands stilled in their work. They'd discussed the possibility of trying to locate Wade's estranged family many times over the months, but both had been reluctant to risk disturbing whatever peace his wife and daughter might have found. The fear of rejection had kept Wade from reaching out, even as Ruby had encouraged him to consider the attempt. "Emma wrote to me," Wade said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. The statement hung in the air like the notes from Ruby's wind chime, beautiful and fragile and full of implications that could change everything. Ruby turned toward Wade with an expression that mixed joy and concern in equal measure, understanding immediately how much this contact meant to him. "How did she find us?" Ruby asked gently. "Apparently one of those newspaper articles mentioned my name," Wade explained, unfolding the letter carefully as if it might disintegrate at rough handling. "She's been looking for me for 3 years, ever since she turned 18, and could make her own decisions about contact. Her mother—" He paused, struggling with emotions that had been buried for years. "Her mother never remarried. She's been keeping my letters, all the ones I wrote but never sent." Ruby felt tears gathering in her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what Wade was sharing. "What does Emma say?" Wade's voice caught as he read directly from the letter. "She says, 'Dear Papa, I've been proud of what you did my whole life, even when I was too young to understand why it had to cost us so much. I want you to know that Mama and I have never stopped loving you, and we've never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to us. I've read about Ruby in the newspapers, and I want to meet the girl who helped my father find his way back to being the man I always remembered.'" The words carried the weight of years of separation and the promise of healing that none of them had dared to hope for. Mrs. Henley wiped her eyes with her apron, and Doc Harrison cleared his throat gruffly, both moved by the raw emotion in Wade's voice. "Does she want you to come to Philadelphia?" Ruby asked carefully, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the joy mixed with nervousness in Wade's expression. "She wants to come here," Wade replied, his voice growing stronger as he shared the rest of Emma's message. "She's planning to take the train to Denver next month, then travel by stagecoach to Hollow Creek. She says she wants to see the place where her father learned to hope again, and she wants to understand the work that's brought him peace." Ruby smiled through her tears, her fingers finding the golden thimble she now wore on a chain around her neck. The small sewing tool had become her personal talisman, a reminder that love could endure across years of separation and doubt. But now it represented something more, the possibility of healing that came when people had the courage to reach across the distances that life had created between them. "I can't wait to meet her," Ruby said, her voice strong with genuine anticipation. "And I can't wait to show her everything we've built here together." Wade reached out and took Ruby's hand, squeezing gently in a gesture that conveyed years of gratitude and affection. "She wants to learn the restoration techniques we use. Says she's always been good with her hands, like her old papa." The future stretched ahead of them now, with possibilities none of them had imagined when Wade first rode into Hollow Creek 6 months earlier. A blind girl who'd survived on the margins of society had become the curator of a museum that drew visitors from across the territory. A disgraced cavalry officer had found redemption through service to someone who needed his protection and wisdom. A dying town had discovered new life through the simple act of recognizing value where others saw only refuse. The wind chime sang softly in the morning breeze, its harmonious tones carrying across streets that now bustled with purpose and hope. Children played in yards that their parents had returned to reclaim. Visitors walked the dusty sidewalks with cameras and notebooks, documenting the miracle of a community that had learned to see treasure in the most unlikely places. Ruby arranged the new acquisitions with the same careful attention she'd once given to her collection of discards, but now her work carried the weight of institutional purpose and community recognition. She was no longer just surviving, she was preserving and creating, teaching and inspiring, contributing to something larger than herself while remaining true to the gift that had always set her apart. Sometimes the most valuable things were hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their worth and the courage to help others see what had always been there. In Hollow Creek, a blind girl and a broken-down cowboy had reminded an entire community what vision really meant, and in doing so, they had found their way home to the family they were always meant to be.